When Yale's most arrogant professor told John Kennedy he was too simple to understand the Constitution, the audience laughed. Kennedy remained silent, then calmly asked one question that exposed her ignorance and left the room in stunned silence. The Yale Law School auditorium hummed with the kind of intellectual energy that only accompanied the most prestigious academic gatherings. Mahogany-paneled walls, lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, gazed down upon an audience of the nation's legal elite: federal judges, Supreme Court clerks, constitutional scholars, and law students who represented the cream of America's academic crop. The November evening had brought together this distinguished assembly for the annual Blackstone Constitutional Symposium, a debate series that had become legendary for featuring some of the most brilliant legal minds in heated discussions about the fundamental principles that governed American democracy. The stage was set with two podiums facing each other across a polished wooden platform, each equipped with microphones and reading lights that cast warm pools of illumination against the darker auditorium beyond. Between them sat a moderator's table, where Professor Emeritus Harold Whitman, himself a former Supreme Court clerk and respected constitutional scholar, prepared to oversee what promised to be one of the most anticipated debates in the symposium's 20-year history. Dr. Margaret Thornfield stood behind the left podium, her posture radiating the kind of intellectual confidence that came from 30 years of dominating classrooms, courtrooms, and academic conferences. At 58, she remained one of Yale Law School's most formidable professors, a woman whose sharp intellect and sharper tongue had made her both feared and revered by generations of law students. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her angular features, and her black academic robes seemed to amplify her already commanding presence. Thornfield had built her career on a particular brand of constitutional interpretation that emphasized the need for sophisticated legal minds to guide the evolution of American jurisprudence. She believed passionately that the Constitution was a living document that required constant reinterpretation by educated elites who understood its complexities better than the common citizens it was meant to govern. Her academic papers were filled with dense theoretical frameworks and complex philosophical arguments that had earned her tenure at Yale and respect among her intellectual peers. More importantly for tonight's debate, Thornfield had spent the better part of 3 decades developing a reputation for intellectual ruthlessness that made her one of the most feared debaters in academic circles. She had a particular talent for identifying her opponent's weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision, often leaving distinguished scholars stammering and humiliated before audiences of their peers. Her colleagues sometimes whispered that she seemed to take genuine pleasure in demonstrating her intellectual superiority, especially when facing opponents she deemed unworthy of serious consideration.
Across the stage, Senator John Neely Kennedy stood behind the right podium, his modest appearance creating a stark contrast to Thornfield's imposing academic regalia. His simple dark suit and unassuming demeanor made him look almost out of place among the assembled legal luminaries, like a working man who had somehow wandered into a gathering of intellectual aristocrats. His Louisiana accent would mark him immediately as an outsider in this world of Ivy League credentials and East Coast sophistication. What the audience didn't fully appreciate was that Kennedy's presence at tonight's debate represented something far more significant than academic curiosity. The senator had been invited to represent what the symposium organizers called the political perspective on constitutional interpretation, a role that many in the audience clearly viewed as inferior to the purely academic approach that Thornfield embodied. The invitation itself had been somewhat controversial among Yale's faculty, with several professors questioning whether a mere politician could contribute meaningfully to a serious constitutional discussion. Kennedy had accepted the invitation, knowing exactly what kind of reception he could expect from an audience that viewed practical political experience as less valuable than theoretical academic study. He had come prepared not just to defend his positions, but to challenge assumptions about who was qualified to interpret the Constitution and what kinds of knowledge mattered most in understanding America's founding principles. The topic for tonight's debate was constitutional originalism versus living constitution theory, a subject that had divided legal scholars for decades and remained one of the most contentious issues in American jurisprudence. Thornfield would be arguing for the living constitution approach, which held that the document's meaning should evolve with changing social conditions and contemporary understanding. Kennedy would be defending originalism, the view that constitutional interpretation should be grounded in the original meaning of the text as understood by those who wrote and ratified it. Professor Whitman called the debate to order with the traditional academic formality that marked such occasions. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's Constitutional Symposium. We're honored to have with us Dr. Margaret Thornfield, Yale's Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law, and Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, who will be discussing one of the most fundamental questions in American jurisprudence. Thornfield was given the opportunity to present her opening argument first, and she approached the task with the confidence of someone who had never lost a serious intellectual debate. For 20 minutes, she delivered a masterful presentation that touched on evolving social norms, changing technological conditions, and the need for constitutional interpretation to remain relevant to contemporary challenges. Her argument was sophisticated and well-reasoned, peppered with citations of obscure legal precedents and complex theoretical frameworks that demonstrated her mastery of constitutional scholarship. She spoke of the Constitution as a framework that required constant reinterpretation by educated legal minds who could understand its deeper principles and apply them to modern circumstances that the founders could never have anticipated. The Constitution, she concluded with obvious satisfaction, is not a suicide pact frozen in the amber of 18th century thinking. It is a living document that must evolve with our understanding of justice, equality, and human dignity. This evolution requires sophisticated legal interpretation by those who have dedicated their lives to understanding the complex interplay between law, society, and moral progress.
The audience applauded enthusiastically, clearly impressed by the depth and sophistication of Thornfield's presentation. Several audience members nodded in agreement, recognizing the kind of intellectual rigor that they had come to expect from Yale's most distinguished faculty members. Kennedy's turn came next, and he approached his opening statement with a very different style than Thornfield's academic formality. His Louisiana drawl was immediately apparent as he began to speak, and something in his tone suggested that he was going to take a fundamentally different approach to the evening's discussion. "Professor Thornfield has given us a very elegant argument," Kennedy began, his voice carrying the kind of respectful courtesy that characterized most of his public speaking. "But I'd like to suggest that maybe we're making this more complicated than it needs to be. The Constitution isn't a puzzle that only Harvard and Yale graduates can solve. It's a document that was written to be understood by ordinary Americans who wanted to know what their government could and couldn't do." Kennedy's approach was immediately different from what the audience expected. Rather than matching Thornfield's theoretical sophistication, he grounded his argument in practical examples and historical context that made constitutional principles accessible to anyone listening. He spoke about the founders' actual words and actions, their debates during the ratification process, and their clear intention to create a government constrained by written law rather than the preferences of temporary majorities. The beauty of originalism, Kennedy continued, isn't that it's complicated or sophisticated, it's that it's honest. When we interpret the Constitution based on what it actually says and what the people who wrote it actually meant, we're respecting democracy instead of substituting our own preferences for the will of the people who ratified that document. As Kennedy spoke, Thornfield's expression grew increasingly contemptuous. She had expected to face an opponent who would at least attempt to match her intellectual sophistication, but instead she was listening to what she clearly viewed as simplistic appeals to common sense and historical literalism. Her face showed the kind of barely concealed disdain that academics often displayed when confronted with arguments they considered beneath serious consideration. When Kennedy concluded his opening statement, Thornfield was practically vibrating with eagerness to respond. Professor Whitman recognized her for the rebuttal period, and she launched immediately into what was clearly going to be a devastating critique of Kennedy's position. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the tone of a professor correcting a particularly slow student, "I think Senator Kennedy's comments perfectly illustrate why constitutional interpretation should be left to serious legal scholars rather than politicians who think that complex legal questions can be answered with folksy wisdom and appeals to common sense." The audience stirred with anticipation, sensing that Thornfield was building towards something significant. Kennedy sat perfectly still behind his podium, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture suggested that he was paying very careful attention to where Thornfield was heading with her attack. "The senator's approach to constitutional interpretation," Thornfield continued, her voice growing more animated as she warmed to her critique, "reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how law actually works in a complex modern society. Constitutional principles can't be reduced to simple slogans or historical platitudes. They require sophisticated analysis by people who understand the intricate relationships between legal doctrine, social policy, and evolving standards of justice." She paused dramatically, looking directly at Kennedy with an expression that combined pity and condescension. "Senator Kennedy, I don't mean this as a personal attack, but your approach to constitutional interpretation is simply too simple for the complexities we face in modern jurisprudence. These issues require intellectual rigor and academic sophistication that goes far beyond the kind of political rhetoric that might work in Louisiana campaign speeches." The words "too simple" echoed through the auditorium like a physical presence, and Kennedy could feel the collective reaction of the audience, some uncomfortable with Thornfield's obvious condescension, others clearly enjoying the spectacle of a Southern politician being intellectually dismantled by one of Yale's most distinguished professors. Thornfield wasn't finished with her attack. She had found what she believed was Kennedy's weakness, and she was going to exploit it with the kind of academic ruthlessness that had made her reputation. "The Constitution isn't a document that can be understood by reading it like a recipe or an instruction manual. It requires years of study, deep knowledge of legal precedent, and the kind of analytical sophistication that comes from serious academic training." She gestured at Kennedy with barely concealed contempt. "I'm sure the senator means well, but constitutional interpretation isn't something that can be accomplished through political instinct or appeals to so-called common sense. It requires the kind of intellectual framework that, frankly, most politicians simply don't possess." The audience was completely silent now, with many leaning forward in their seats to catch every word of what was clearly becoming a one-sided intellectual assault. Thornfield had positioned herself as the defender of serious scholarship against the forces of anti-intellectual populism, and she was delivering her critique with the kind of devastating precision that had made her one of the most feared debaters in academic circles.
Kennedy listened to every word without interruption, his hands folded calmly in front of him, his expression showing no sign of anger or offense. When Thornfield finished her attack and Professor Whitman invited Kennedy to respond, the senator stood quietly for several seconds, as if carefully considering how to address the critique he had just received. When Kennedy finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, carrying the kind of patient courtesy that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand Thornfield's position rather than simply defend his own. "Professor Thornfield," he said, his Louisiana drawl unmistakable, but his tone respectful, "I appreciate your perspective on constitutional interpretation, and I certainly don't question your academic credentials or your years of study. But since you've raised the question of who's qualified to interpret the Constitution, maybe you could help me with something that's been puzzling me." Thornfield straightened behind her podium, clearly expecting Kennedy to ask some simplistic question that would allow her to demonstrate her superior knowledge once again. "Of course, Senator. I'd be happy to educate you about constitutional principles." Kennedy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, well-worn copy of the Constitution, the kind that millions of Americans carried in their wallets or purses. He opened it to a specific page and studied it for a moment before looking up at Thornfield with genuine curiosity. "Professor, you've spent 30 years teaching constitutional law at Yale, and you've written extensively about the need for sophisticated interpretation of constitutional principles. So I'm hoping you can clarify something for me about the Commerce Clause." Thornfield nodded confidently, clearly anticipating an easy opportunity to demonstrate her expertise on one of the most important and frequently litigated provisions of the Constitution. "Of course, Senator. I'd be happy to educate you about constitutional principles."
Kennedy's question was delivered in the same soft, respectful tone he had maintained throughout the evening, but its content was devastating in its simplicity. "Could you tell me what the Commerce Clause actually says? Not what the Supreme Court has said about it, not what scholars have written about it, but what the actual text says." The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and Thornfield's confident expression began to waver as she realized that Kennedy wasn't asking for her interpretation or analysis, but for her knowledge of the basic text that formed the foundation of all constitutional interpretation. "Well," Thornfield began, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, "the Commerce Clause deals with congressional power to regulate interstate commerce, and it's been interpreted in various ways." "Professor, I'm not asking for interpretation. I'm asking if you can tell me what the clause actually says, word for word." The auditorium was completely silent now, with the audience beginning to sense that something significant was happening. Thornfield stared at Kennedy, her mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to recall the exact text of one of the most fundamental provisions in American constitutional law. Kennedy waited patiently for several seconds before providing the answer himself, reading directly from the Constitution in his hands. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. "The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes." He looked up at Thornfield, his expression showing no triumph, only a kind of gentle disappointment. "Professor, you've spent 30 decades teaching constitutional law, and you've just told this audience that I'm too simple to understand constitutional interpretation. But you can't recite the basic text of one of the most important clauses in the document." The impact of Kennedy's revelation was immediate and devastating. Thornfield stood frozen behind her podium, her face flushed with embarrassment, as she realized that her intellectual arrogance had been exposed by her ignorance of the very document she claimed to understand better than anyone else. Kennedy wasn't finished. His voice remained gentle,
But his words continued to systematically dismantle Thornfield's credibility. You know what I find interesting, Professor? You've written dozens of articles about the need for sophisticated interpretation of constitutional principles, but you apparently haven't bothered to memorize the actual words that form the basis of all that interpretation. He gestured slightly toward the audience as if addressing them directly. How can someone claim to be an expert on constitutional law if they don't know what the Constitution actually says? How can they argue for complex interpretation of text they haven't taken the time to learn? Thornfield tried to recover, her voice weak and defensive. Senator, the exact wording is less important than understanding the broader principles. Is it? Kennedy asked, his tone still respectful, but carrying an edge of steel now. Because it seems to me that if you're going to spend your career telling people what the Constitution means, you ought to start by knowing what it says. Kennedy's final point was delivered with devastating simplicity. Professor Thornfield, you called me too simple to understand constitutional interpretation. But maybe the problem isn't that I'm too simple. Maybe the problem is that you've made something simple into something complicated because you've forgotten that the Constitution was written to be understood by ordinary Americans, not just by people with Yale degrees.
The auditorium erupted in scattered applause, with even some of Thornfield's academic colleagues recognizing the power of Kennedy's response. The woman who had begun the evening as a confident intellectual aristocrat had been reduced to a humiliated figure whose expertise had been exposed as superficial posturing. The debate continued for another hour, but the damage was done. Thornfield struggled through the remaining questions, her earlier confidence completely shattered by the revelation that she had spent decades theorizing about a document she didn't actually know. Kennedy, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate not just his knowledge of constitutional text, but his understanding of the historical context and practical implications that gave that text meaning. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Video clips of the exchange went viral within hours, with particular focus on the moment when Thornfield couldn't recite the Commerce Clause, and Kennedy's quiet but devastating response. Legal blogs and news outlets picked up the story immediately, with many noting that Kennedy had delivered a masterclass in the importance of knowing fundamental texts before attempting to interpret them. For Thornfield, the debate represented a career-defining humiliation that undermined her reputation and authority within academic circles. Her inability to recite basic constitutional text became a symbol of academic arrogance disconnected from fundamental knowledge, and she found herself the subject of criticism from colleagues who had previously respected her scholarship.
Kennedy, meanwhile, earned praise from across the political spectrum for his demonstration that practical knowledge and respect for foundational texts mattered more than theoretical sophistication. His quiet dismantling of Thornfield's pretensions became a viral moment that reinforced his reputation as someone who combined genuine learning with humility and common sense. The lesson of the debate was clear. True expertise required not just sophisticated analysis, but fundamental knowledge of the basic materials being analyzed. Kennedy had proven that someone could be simple in approach while being profound in understanding, and that academic credentials meant nothing without genuine mastery of the subject matter they were supposed to represent. If this story of knowledge triumphing over pretension inspired you, please support our channel with a like and subscription. Every interaction helps us share more tales that remind us of the power of genuine learning, humility, and the importance of mastering fundamentals before claiming expertise. Let's keep these important conversations alive, one story at a time.